two speakers here, Tabitha Nikolai and Emma Lugo, whom I'll introduce shortly for their wonderful work. And I'd also like to thank Mac McFarland, the former director of the Center for Contemporary Art and Culture at PNCA, but still assistant professor at PNCA and now director at Converge 45, for his support and also the support of Converge 45. I'd also like to thank Elizabeth Ballou at Paragon for collaborating with us as well, and Caitlin Petrick, Maisie Moon, and Maximiliano for their installation expertise in helping us install Tabitha's work under her direction. And finally to Chris Kim for his support creating the gallery online where you can view Tabitha's work remotely. And also to Weston and Caitlin for their technical support this evening. And now I'm just going to briefly introduce the exhibition, Networks of Belonging, review logistics for tonight, since we're going to do a little platform switching and introduce our wonderful speakers. So Networks of Belonging explores relational traces embedded within and structuring artistic networks. The installations, videos, and publication of Canaries Collective, Rami George, Tabitha Nikolai, and Mengda Zhang disclose systems of care, communality, labor relations, and familial ties bound by tensions and desires. Networks of Belonging unfolds across a series of physical and virtual sites, creating a network all its own. The exhibition includes a group show at the Center for Contemporary Art and Culture, including Tabitha's work that we'll see tonight, alongside the work of the aforementioned artists. The exhibition also features a satellite solo presentation of Rami George at Paragon Arts Gallery entitled "And One Day We'll Tell You So Many Stories," and that's on view all day, every day in their window galleries through November 15th. And the exhibition has a series of programs, of which this is the third of 4, and remote viewing capabilities on the PNCA online galleries. There you'll find the exhibition guide. You'll also see installation photography. You can view the works for themselves, which the artists were very generous to provide for the run of the show, and also an audio guide and accessible captions. And so if you'd like to see the physical exhibition in person at CCAC on Saturdays and Sundays from 12 to 4, you can make an appointment by emailing ccac@pnca.edu. And I'm going to drop these resources right now in the chat for everyone so that you can take a look for yourselves. And so just a few logistics for tonight. We have the distinct pleasure of having Tabitha conduct an activation of her work, Shrine Maidens of the Unzili Court, for us, followed by a conversation with Emma. And for this activation, I will be dropping a Twitch link in the chat. And after I introduce both our speakers, we'll take a trip over there. So what you can do is you can leave the Zoom screen up and you can mute yourself and stop the video. And then you'll click on the link and you'll hear Tabitha talking about her work, and you'll also see the work actually come up. You should see her navigating the game. I would advise that you make sure you turn up the volume on the game itself. There's a little speaker where you can turn up the volume so you can hear it. And you can also chat with her on Twitch if you have an account. If not, you can chat on the Zoom when we come back. You can drop questions in the Zoom chat for later for the audience Q&A. And then Tabitha will redirect us at the end of the activation back to Zoom, where we'll rejoin her there. So now for our speakers, I'll introduce them. Tabitha Nikolai is a transgender gutter elf and low-level cyber image raised in Salt Lake City, Utah, and based in Portland, Oregon. She creates the things that would have better sustained her younger self, simulations of a more livable future and the obstacles that intervene. These look like fictive text, video games, cosplay, and earnest rites of suburban occult. Currently, she teaches and manages galleries for the Portland State University School of Art and Design. Her work has been shown at the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art, the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art, Vox Populi in Philadelphia, Genka Gallery in Tokyo, and has been covered by ID Magazine, the New York Times, and Art in America. She hopes you're doing okay. Emma Lugo is a community activist and board member at KBOO Community Radio. As a trans queer woman, she became involved in organizing within the transgender community in 2014, helping to organize the first ever transgender rights march in Portland, Oregon. She has also served as a panelist and organizer on a range of queer community projects, including organizing a panel of transgender members of the US military, and as principal organizer of the Transgender Day of Remembrance Interfaith Vigil, which hosted US Senator Jeff Merkley as keynote speaker. A small business owner, Emma is married to her wife. She co-manages their landscape business with. On air, Emma co-hosts the radio program Transpositive, which uplifts the voices of the transgender and non-binary community through interviews and an exploration relevant to the community. As an abolitionist and prison activist, Emma also co-hosts the radio program Prison Pipeline, which interviews and brings to public awareness aspects of the prison industrial complex from a humanitarian perspective, and a view toward representing the authentic voices of those inside and the issues which form the narratives of their lived experience, Outside of KBOO, Emma serves on the board of her shul, Congregation Shir Tikva, and serves as the secretary of the Pacific Green Party and is a 3-time candidate for US Senate. So now that we've learned a little bit more about our speakers, I'm going to drop this Twitch link in the chat. If you'll all click on that, mute and stop your videos with us, we'll see you over there.
I'll see you in a second. Hey folks, thanks. Hopefully everybody makes it back across all okay. Maybe we want to give people a second, I'm not sure.
Okay. Wow, that was really amazing, Tabitha. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah.
Um, I don't think I made it quite that far when I did the walkthrough of your space. It's just it's amazing that you created all of that. You're just somebody in the chat like posted this is beautiful, and that was my thought too. So
Yeah, thanks.
I have like a whole set of questions, but I I wanted to ask you first, just before I get into the questions I already prepared to ask you, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what we just saw. Can you kind of describe to
Yeah.
us now in real time what were we looking at, and how did you come to create this piece?
Yeah. You were looking at this kind of apocalyptic world, and you kind of, I think the start of it is almost this intentional jump cut where you don't really know, you're kind of in the bushes and you find a spider and you're just sort of like immersed in this like uncertain experience. So you're sort of set up to be like looking for something to make this whole thing make sense. And I think formally you're sort of pulled towards the house as being this, light in the woods, this, potential source of security amidst that. But obviously it's uncomfortable. Is it inhabited? Is it uninhabited? And as you kind of like descend, down the rabbit hole, so to speak, you find yourself there. And there's, it's conspicuous that there's no other real like interaction in the game. So, you can spend time looking around the house and not really encounter a point of connection. But, the point of connection that you can find is through this like strange mediated form, with this person who's kind of like copying all this attitude and trying to explain you about the terms of this dark world that you're kind of in the position of being an amnesiac or something within. You're trying to kind of get up to speed about the terms of the world, which obviously has a metaphor with, I don't know, coming into any sort of like consciousness, gender consciousness in this case. So I think that's sort of in a nutshell, metaphorically and sort of literally what you're looking at.
I couldn't help but notice. Sorry to go here right away, but I couldn't help but
Go
notice that
then. Oh,
when we got into the temple, like it basically looked like the form that was kind of like outside of the room. It basically looked like a giant vagina. That's what I
Yeah.
was seeing. I don't know if that's what it was supposed to be, but it sure looked like that was a beautiful giant vagina. That's kind of what I was seeing.
That's
What is
literally
it?
that's literally what it was.
That's what it
Yeah,
was. Okay,
I have a
thank
little
you.
bit of sculpting. That one's not an asset flip. Everything else pretty much in the game is an asset flip, but I actually sculpted that in a 3D modeling program. So
That was
it's a lot. Thank
beautiful.
you.
That was a beautiful vagina. Thank you.
I appreciate
So I'm
it.
going to go into my
I do what I
questions
can for the
now.
people. Yeah, please do.
So okay, so when I was doing some research on your work, I mean we've talked before, but for this for this for
Mhm.
this thing tonight, I wanted to ask you some questions. So when I was doing some research on your
Yeah.
work, you mentioned that in one of your statements of your work, you say that you find that
Mhm.
words often fail to describe trans experiences. You say that you are defining this as in between, as in flux, as occupied position, post truth according to past truth claims. And then you say, because the existence of subjects like me has been brutally suppressed, I lack the vocabulary to coherently speak my truth. And so I reach into myth and neologisms and into ruptures where cultural mores have lapsed, and something akin to me can be glimpsed. So I'd like to ask you to kind of maybe unpack that a little bit, and maybe we can have a
Mhm.
conversation about what you're saying there. Does it just
Yeah,
speak
for
for
sure.
itself, or is there?
I don't know if anything speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And I always like to be, I think, a bit poetic in terms of the artist statements that I write, because I don't want to be, like I was saying, I think a bit during the stream, I don't want to be like too guiding with it. I'm bad at holding words in my head for long. So words that I remember and writing that statement are about, like, you know, a lot of times the only way you see trans people is in mythology. Or for me, you know, as somebody who grew up online, you know, the first trans people I ever encountered were in porn. And so that's the only
Mhm.
space that I saw a sort of version of myself. And I guess that's what I mean by like those cracks, those cultural mores, these kind of like taboo, weird, maybe also like we could think of those as kind of digital grottos, these like digital subterranean spaces that you kind of find versions of yourself. And so you're left with those as bits of language to try to constitute an experience, because the language that you inherit is medicalized, is made by people who aren't ever going to mostly have your experience. So what kind of experience and what kind of language can you create for yourself? That's a bit
Mhm.
of what I was saying there.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So, what do you think it means to you as an artist? And I mean, do you think that other trans folks basically have the same kind of experience? I feel like one of the really interesting things that you said was that I mean, it's all very interesting, but one of the things that really caught my attention was that you mentioned that
Mhm.
one of the first experiences that you had of transgender people was in pornography, which, you know, is true
Mhm.
because we're often like made into like a fetish. And so it would make sense
Mhm.
that like within the mainstream culture, like if you're doing keyword searches on YouTube, or if you're like looking online, if you're going through digital space trying to find some sort of accurate representation of your identity, the first thing you're going to come across
Mhm.
is, you know, a pornographic representation of your identity. I mean, how do you think that
Mhm.
having that kind of experience of like an authenticated identity like informs like how trans artists work? And uh, you know, what can we do to create a more authentic language about trans identity?
Mm. Wow, that is a huge question. Um, I mean, it's hard. I think it's like, I'm always like a little skeptical of authenticity, and maybe that's also part of what I'm saying in that. I
Yeah, I
mean,
see that in
it's
your
hard.
work.
It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's like, it's definitely inherited and you're kind of making something out of it. But I think so many things are inherited language. How you make something sort of whole cloth is difficult. But I think that's also important. I mean, a lot of the collaborations that I do are mainly with trans folks, because that's important to me to try to incubate some sort of connection and some sort of community there. And, you know, some of it is like trying to make things digitally, but then to like parallel those with physical experiences where you're getting time together producing physical things, or even just kind of like making food or being together with each other, to kind of like I don't know, what's a word that I'm looking for, decrypt or de-escalate one, de something. I mean, I think although I'm a digital artist and I've spent a lot of times in digital spaces, like I'm saying, um, there's there's a lot of toxicity in digital spaces, and I think the architects of those spaces often incentivize that toxicity because it's profitable. And so I think one of the ways we maybe make work that's in authentic or create ourselves is, you know, authentic subjects, or, you know, to just even be able to create solidarity together, is to try to like remove ourselves from those systems, to the
Hmm.
extent possible, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Do you think that it's problematic in any way that many people create their like sense of what it means to be transgender like through pornography, or is that like maybe an opening that didn't even exist in the past? Like maybe it's a way in. I don't know. I mean, I'm
Oh.
personally, I don't really have any problem with pornography, including, you know, pornographic
Mhm.
representations of trans folks, because I think that you know, all work is legitimate work and sex work is definitely legitimate work, and it's providing something that's really meaningful to like a certain demographic. It may not be an authentic truth of most trans people, but it's definitely like the truth that most people understand about trans identity. So do you think it's problematic that that's a way that people kind of like step into an understanding of like who we are, or is that like, you know, a possibility?
I mean, I think it can be both, and I appreciate you pointing to it in the ways that it's absolutely valid work. And yeah, I definitely don't want anything I say to be perceived as either sex work negative or sex negative. You know, but I think it's also about control. I think I'm often leery of conversations about representation because representation isn't control, it isn't meaningful power. So yes, those are often spaces of representation, but they're often also spaces of representation minus like control or enfranchisement into the broader power structures that that control the money, that control the power of those sorts of things. Yeah, I guess that's what I have to say about that
Thank you.
offhand.
I'd like to
Yeah.
talk to you a little bit about your process and your what so I'm wondering, one of the first things I'm wondering is how does your work intersect with being trans? So, you know, like you could easily come to your work and not necessarily know that you're transgender. And it's, I mean, and I think it's really important to like just like look at your work as art, like not being informed by any kind of identity, like, you know, that's I mean it's important to also be informed by identity, but it's also important as art, just like look at it as it is, because you know that gives you an equal footing with all artists rather than, you know, kind of giving some sort of privileging to your to like what you do. So I'm wondering, as an artist, how does your work as an artist intersect with your identity as a trans identifying person?
Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, I guess I'm a believer that there's no separating oneself from
Okay.
one's identity. So I think I'm in a point in terms of my work where increasingly I'm not wanting to do work that is overtly about trans identity. You know, this piece in particular, I mean, I really enjoy being able to revisit it. I made it in 2018. But more and more I'm disinterested in doing work that explores those things overtly for a bunch of reasons, because you know, my artistic practice is my way of like trying to make sense of the world. And I feel like to some extent I've reconciled through doing that work some of these questions that are less about being questions for me anymore. But also because it is at times it can be pigeonholing. There can be an expectation that you're going to be doing this work and that it's also going to be speaking to a largely non-trans audience about trans issues. And that can be at times tokenizing. That can be, it can honestly, and I think this is, I wonder to what extent this is something other trans artists deal with, is it can hold you back if you're endlessly doing trans 101 kind of work. What other things, what other problems are there that you could be working on, either for yourself or for others, or, you know, whatever. But I guess that's kind of where my identity is in relation to it these days.
Yeah, that was a wonderful answer. Thank you. I mean, it can be hugely problematic to kind of be the trans artist or a trans artist, because it, like you said, it can pigeonhole, you know, your work. And it's 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 challenging because like right now we're kind of on the edge of something. Like we're either on the edge of like a great loss, or we're on the edge of maybe a great movement forward culturally. I'm not sure which way we're going, but you
Yeah.
know, so like, but you don't want to be an artist who's always in a position of having to just educate people, and yet at the same time, that's kind of a reality of being in the public space, like within the public sphere, is that that ends up happening regardless of whether you intend it to or not. But so one of the things that you were talking about earlier that really interests me, and part of why I was really interested in being on this panel, is because I'm really curious about how you see digital space and online space as a place for like authentically validating trans identities, and also as a place of connection. The topic of this theme tonight is both like about digital and online spaces as a place of connection. I mean, this is mostly about your work, but it's also about talking about how
Mhm.
digital and online spaces are both a place of connection and a place of apathy. And
Mm.
I'm wondering, like, how do you see digital online space, like within the framework of that theme? Like, do you see online space and digital space as someplace that's kind of been like a liberatory space for you as an artist, or do you find
Mm.
it to be kind of impeding your work as an artist? And how do you feel about the topic of apathy? Do you think that it's a space where apathy is kind of the norm within like trans communities, or do you think that
Mm.
this idea of like connection is something that's actually something that happens in digital space?
Yes, to all of it. I don't know. I guess maybe I'm not sure. I don't know how I see apathy. I mean, I definitely see personally ambivalence about digital connection. Um, you ask such great big questions. Um, Yeah, I mean, I see the ambivalence in that it's needed space for all kinds of folks who for all kinds of reasons can't connect in physical worlds, but you know, there's just so many ways that the platforms themselves are compromised, they're quantified, they're, for profit of bigger companies. I think there's a lot that you can learn in those spaces, but how much we see each other as human in those spaces, I'm not really sure. Um, or maybe you can tell me more about how you see apathy, and we can address that.
Sure, I will do that in just a minute. It looks like we have a really great
Mhm.
question from one of our audience members, which is directly connected to what you were just saying.
Mm.
Sergey Smolin asks, with regard to your discussion on authenticity, do you feel that the digital world is more authentic than the analog world?
Mm. Yeah, I think a couple things. I mean, in a way, I think yes. I think through through those fantasy spaces, a lot of things, and by fantasy I mean a whole host of things. I mean the extent to which game spaces are certainly fantasy, the extent to which when we're online we're performing a version of ourself, even if it's connected to ourselves in the real world. Online spaces are really performative in general, so that's sort of what I mean when I'm talking about fantasy. But it's like in those spaces, we're letting versions of ourselves out that we wouldn't otherwise maybe manifest in a physical world. And I think you can kind of glimpse higher truths of who we are when we're in those spaces. Whether that's for good or bad, those kind of like, I don't know, id impulses tend to leak out more in those spaces.
For a lot of trans and non-binary folks, coming to online and digital spaces is where they have some of their first interactions with other folks who are trans and non-binary. Um,
Mm.
Online digital spaces are also places where folks can, kind of explore who they are. And especially for
Mm.
trans youth, they're really safe spaces. Can you comment on the role that online and digital technology like played within your own transition?
Mm. Yeah, I think I grew up playing tons of video games. I grew up playing like Dungeons and Dragons. And so I was sort of like primed to be trying on like other versions of self, in little facets and shards in those kinds of spaces. I think I came to a more full readiness and consciousness of it, not from occupying like explicitly identitarian, queer, trans kind of spaces, but through spending a lot of time on 4chan, to be honest. And this was at the time that bronies were becoming a thing, if anybody even
Remember
remembers
bronies?
that
Yes,
anymore.
totally.
in the swirl of weird culture that's been happening. But I think I kind of had this moment where of awareness that's like, oh my God, if these people can be, you know, are organizing conferences of their pony personas, not that there's anything wrong with that at all, but it's like,
No.
if they can do that, then I can just become a woman and that's fine. But, you know, back to Sergey's question, you know, thinking about 4chan, there's a space where people are, you know, being authentically themselves, I think in a big way. It just turns out that they're often like misogynist, racist, hateful things. And I think that's just the fantastical reality that a lot of people choose to express. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, in terms of authenticity and your bigger questions about authenticity, Emma, I think my concern about digital spaces as spaces of authenticity, of validation, is that a lot of them, it's not just compromised in terms of like it's part of surveillance culture or people are making money off of it. It's that the money that's being made off of it is also in part in terms of creating behavior that, you know, maybe I sound like tinfoil hat or something like that, but it's like a lot of the social media companies are grooming you to behave in a certain way, to consume certain things, you know, whether that's for clicks or products in real life. And to me, that's the fear of it, is that in like bringing identity into those spaces, you're sort of falling into that trap of representation by being kind of shuttled around and being put in boxes within those spaces, if that makes sense.
Wow. Yeah, totally. It helps me really see your work even with like a new lens, because I see that you are very passionate about the authenticity of like your vision as an artist and the ways in which like digital technology can like manipulate the viewer, or let's use a better, more accurate word, can manipulate the consumer into moving even unconsciously in directions which it intends them to move into. And so in a way, maybe your art is an act of resistance against that manipulation. Is that accurate?
I don't know if I want to claim. I don't know if I want to claim that. That feels like a big thing to claim.
Okay.
That it's an act of resistance.
Sorry.
I think it's an act of me figuring that out and wanting to have a conversation about it. Whether it's anything more than that, I'm not sure. But
Within
yeah,
your
I hear you. I
digital
hear. I hear the
spaces,
argument you're making.
within the digital spaces that you create, one of the things that I notice is that you work both with the manipulation of three-dimensional space, and you create these really amazing space, you know, digital spaces. To me, it's incredible. I don't know how you do it, but they're so beautiful and so well constructed, and they're so detailed. But I also noticed that you work a little bit with text, like I noticed that like when I walk through your houses and through your spaces, there'll be text in like kind of random places. It's not always like the easiest text to read. It reminds me of when somebody layers collage. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about like where you choose to incorporate text within your work, like, and how do you choose to incorporate text into it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think almost all of the games I've done for a while they're almost like three-dimensional virtual spatialized zines or something, where there's text in them, but it's like I want to have this intimate experience with a viewer where they're consuming words, and the extent to which words are so powerful because there's so much more abstract, or they're a space for a viewer to insert themselves through imagining something rather than having it literally illustrated. So that's part of it. I mean, and it's each thing that I've done kind of in the progression from like Sic Transex Gloria was probably the first game that I did that had text in it, and then this was the second, and then Ineffable Glossolalia, and then most recently a work called Liquid Dungeon Byproduct that's in a show now at Holding Contemporary. It's like but I didn't write that. A friend of mine, Porpentine, wrote the text for that final one. It's always like trying to find different ways to incorporate the text to pull you in, to have more interactions attached to it. You know, like in the first game I did with text in it, you're literally just moving through space and getting like big walls of text that you encounter. Whereas in this, you're kind of being pulled into something that's more of a conversation. Yeah, so I guess it's just part of a way of having having that conversation with the viewer. But what I like about games as a medium is it can be, you know, when it's something people download and are playing to themselves, it's a very intimate experience. And that's a relationship I really hold dear as an artist, to try to like speak as directly as possible to someone, because I think that's important.
So Jessica Baruski asks, has the work that you create, I'm being a little bit, I'm inserting a little bit here into the question. Has your work
Okay.
taken on a new meaning, changed meaning, or relocated meaning under these current circumstances?
I think I'm not sure what if this work's meaning has changed to me. I mean, work is always meaning different things at different times. I think that's just part of the nature of the beast, is that it's fluid like that. I mean, definitely some of the lines that I was reading there about the crash in the context of this narrative is sort of like presaging some of the political reality that we're having right now, where we feel like things are cracking up. And that speaks to what Emma was saying about this kind of like precipice of fascism that we're on right now. So maybe in that way, there's like a deeper connection. I think the role of art for me has changed a bit now, and I'm kind of like pivoting the work that I want to make, but that's difficult to talk about because it's all like what speculative new work would be. But you know, more than ever, especially with COVID, I've just wanted to do work IRL with people physically in a space, because I want that connection. But that's not super possible, and I hope that someday it will be again soon. So I don't know. That's a good question, though. Thank you.
Within the context of your work as a digital artist, I know that you also do costume design and installation. Within your work as a digital artist, how does maybe you can like help me understand better how digital art fits within the framework of like contemporary art? Because I know that like a lot of people, like when they go to a museum, let's take a museum for instance, a really rock solid, established, everybody sort of agrees this is art. They expect to see like a painting or a sculpture, you know. And so when they see digital art, how does that read? Like, what does that mean to you? And what do you think it means to viewers? Like, where does the kind of work that you create fit within? And I understand that like you're an artist and you already have this whole language that you understand, and there's an entire art world that completely accepts this as art. But within the broader culture, how is this seen? Is this seen as entertainment, or is it as art? How do we get people to read digital art as art?
That's a great question. I don't know if it's important that, God, I think so many things. I mean, one, I'm attracted to doing this work, you know, these virtual environments, these sort of things like games. I'm attracted to doing them, I guess, in an art context because it's an open question, because it's not a solidified form. And I hope that when those are put into exhibition spaces, that keeps it fresh for the viewer. I think I've, at least personally for myself, find a lot of art exhibitions kind of like mausoleums of ideas. They're just sort of like people working in really staid traditional forms. And it doesn't, for me, activate me as a viewer. So I'm hoping by creating a weird, you know, this media that doesn't exist in this context, in that context, it enlivens it. But that said, I'm also beyond that. I don't know that people in general, that I feel like they need to think of this as art. I don't know that I'm attached to like getting that value, because that value is premised on all kinds of maybe fucked up things anyway. You know, how I think a lot of it's, you know, it's funny doing work that's situated in terms of video games, because people that are really actually into video games, this work is really unsatisfying. It's like overly simplistic and not satisfying enough on a lot of levels. And I totally get that. So it's like, I think that's more or less how it's perceived, and it exists in this kind of weird art game niche. But I hope that it, I mean, part of me wanting to do that and be able to like distribute it online through platforms is so that I hope the people that I think could benefit from it can find it easier than going to an art gallery, because a lot of the people that I want to talk to are not going to go to art galleries. So I guess that's part of what I think about audience and art and that.
What do you hope people find when they're playing your game? Like when, I mean, the one that we just, the piece we just saw, like, is a downloadable game. You can get it and you can make a donation, or you can even download it for free if you don't want to make a donation. And you can play it at home on your computer. What do you hope people get out of the experience of playing it as a game? Like, do you hope that it helps them to find something in themselves? Do you hope that it entertains them? It feels like it's almost kind of like you're giving people an opportunity to step into a space, a world that you've created that is really detailed and very interesting. And you have to kind of deconstruct the world that you've created, but it's I mean, in a lot of ways, it reminds me of like how, like within the academy, we're trained to sort of see art. We're supposed to kind of like use all of these different filters to try to decode like what we're looking at. And it's like here you're sort of doing that, but you're making it kind of more of an active process.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great kind of through line from just the way the media might function in a gallery environment, but that the audience, the viewer, the consumer, whatever they are, is also activated by needing to be pulled through it, by needing to exercise some kind of agency of themselves to activate the art. So that's really important for me, just in terms of like encouraging people to I don't know, not just be subject to stuff. What do I hope people find in it? Yeah, I guess I hope people see a degree of themselves, at least when I've talked to people who have found my work online and that kind of thing. That's what I hear from them, and that's the reason to keep making art that I've found, is just like it can be genuinely connective for people when you're doing artwork that's about, not just like formalist sort of things, but like kind of blood and guts stuff. When people find it, it tends to like really mean a lot to them, so that they can see some of themselves in it, maybe that they can have the benefit of some kind of knowledge of experience to like prime them for things they might encounter in the world, in terms of this work being about kind of gnarly experiences, both inside and outside the kind of cybercultural trans underworld that is an actual place. So a bit of that. Yeah, to some extent to be entertained. Like I try to, obviously, a lot of the work that I try to make is aesthetically juicy. And I just think that's important. You want people to stick with it, and you want people to, I don't know, move through it. You got to give them a show. You got to have a big sculpted chrome vulva that's on fire and spewing a psychic storm out of it. It's just common sense.
Zachary Shire says he likes how the latter seem to extend beyond the grotto. Is it maybe an implication that the shrine is sort of limbo space with places above and below, both physically or mentally, spiritually?
That would be cool. I think it's like, I think a lot of the games and a lot of the things that I make, I think of them as interconnected in these like broader, unarticulated in the games, like world building. Like that's really kind of the nuts and bolts of the stuff that I do is art as world building. But in this instance, in a literal sense, the ladder is just meant to be like, you climb back up out of the bathtub, you climbed down that giant ladder, you climb yourself back out. But yeah, I mean, I am attracted to, in video games, those spaces that are like beyond, that you can't access. I grew up playing Chrono Trigger was one of my favorite games growing up, and there's a level there where there's like these floating magical islands, and there's a bunch of them you can't access. And so that's partly back to that digital sublime I was talking about earlier, the idea that the game world can be not just escapist, but like transcendent, like that you could fall into it and go beyond into something that would be a more caring, better magical world than the physical world that you're trying to leave through. It's a weird answer to your question, but
one of my favorite aspects of the piece that we saw today was, that you incorporated water into it, and I mean, water seemed to play a role in a good part of the game that we interacted with, and including walking under the water and coming up out of the water, which was really amazing. It's, I mean, I know it's just like a digital technique that you can create in cyberspace, but it has a very potent effect, and for me it did anyways. So in one of your exhibitions, you say our bodies are our first homes, but learning to see the water around our wetware takes a pivot in perspective. Ask Lana, ask Lily. This work is called Transfuturism. It is a call to stalk the leaky, smoking wreckage of Americana and take from the genetic designers what is useful to us. To creep from the kipple and climb the pyramid towers of medicine, to gouge out the eyes of the makers who withhold life from us. This is not about healing trauma. It is about the theft of fires Promethean and their strategic relocation. With them, we can burn away the parts of ourselves that no longer serve us, not because we're broken, but because we have seen deeply into the virtual and we have the audacity to act. I just wanted to read that because I thought it was beautiful, and I just want to thank you so much for for sharing that. I think that you have this amazing courage and a skill as an artist to represent in so many ways an authentic trans experience that is exceptional and very beautiful. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And I wanted to ask in the audience if we have any other questions. We're going to probably wrap up in the next few minutes. So I don't know if anybody else has questions or if you have more statements you'd like to make, Tabitha. We do have one more question.
I don't have any more statements. Oh, okay. Cool. More questions.
I have another question from Sergey Smolin. Do you feel that the inaccessibility aspect of video games reflects a point you cannot go beyond in reality?
I'm not totally sure I parse the inaccessibility aspect of video games. I mean, I think they are inaccessible to audiences who don't have like a grounding in them. I've definitely encountered that where art audiences aren't super able to play them. They're not really necessarily sure what's going on. I'm just parsing the question a bit more. Do you feel that the inaccessibility aspect of video games reflects a point you cannot go beyond in reality? Games
as a house you can't enter.
Yeah. Does it reflect a point you cannot go beyond in reality? Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I like doing that because it transcends, the fullness of art that you could otherwise have, at least from an installation standpoint. I think it's probably more cinematic. You can allude to those things off camera in film, but I fear that I'm actually not really understanding the question. So, Sergey, I'll find a way to get in touch with Sergey and I can clarify this. If maybe he wants to hang around after, I'll give him my email address so we can talk about it further. Apologies.
Well, thank you both so much. We're going to be wrapping up now because Emma actually has another interview, one of her many other things that she's got on her plate to do. So, but I want to thank you both so much for this really wonderful conversation, and Tabitha for your walkthrough, which was fantastic. Really love the Twitch activation. And so if we could all do a virtual clap or clap on your own, that'd be great for our wonderful speakers. And then I just want to make one small announcement that we have one more program coming up as part of this exhibition. It'll be on November 13th. That'll be an interactive performance with Mengda Zhang from her installation Dust-Free Chat Room, followed by a Q&A. And we ask that you register for this on the CCAC website because it will require that you show yourself on video to interact. So if that's something that you don't want to do, then maybe just hang back. And if it's something you're interested in, feel free to register. And yeah, thanks to everyone again for joining us and our speakers. I hope you all have a wonderful, festive and safe weekend, and take care of yourselves as we go into this next week. Yeah, so signing off now.
Thank you, everyone.
Right,
thank you so much, Emma. I really appreciate your questions and your energy. Thank you, Laurel, for organizing this.
Yeah, of course. Bye.
Thanks. Good night.